Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, welcome. My name is Megan Kennedy-Chouan. I'm the head of the evaluation team at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you today for this event on human rights, gender equality, and the evaluation criteria. Welcome to all of you participating. We do hope this will be an interactive event, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and to use the chat to share any comments, reflections, or questions that you might have during the discussion, during the different presentations. And we will also have plenty of time at the end for discussion with all of you. So please use the chat, and please also update your name in the Zoom participants function so that we can see who you are and where you're coming from. We are expecting people from all around the world this afternoon. For us here in Paris, it's the afternoon. So thank you. As I mentioned at the beginning, for those of you that had already joined, this meeting is being recorded, and we would encourage you to turn on your camera and your microphone if you'd like to ask a question at the end. And we look forward to having this discussion with all of you. Today, we are launching a new document from the OECD called Applying a Human Rights and Gender Equality Lens to the OECD Evaluation Criteria. And these criteria are relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, coherence, impact, and sustainability. And the criteria were revised in 2019, but they were actually originally developed in the 1990s and published and defined in 2002. And since then have become a foundational piece of international evaluation work. So I'd like to thank the colleagues here in the room who are helping to organize the meeting technically, and also to give a very big thank you to DEval for co-hosting today's event with us, and to the OECD Berlin Center in Germany as well for their support with this event. DEval was also part of the EvalNet leadership group, which was also made up of Canada and Spain, who contributed extensively to this guidance. And we would like to thank also our sister network, the Gender Network of the OECD DAC, who worked with us in conceptualizing and developing the content, as well as providing useful input to the guidance. Finally, I'd like to thank Ilse Worm and Marco Hanich, who were the consultants who undertook the first elements of research and drafting for this document, as well as Mariana Gamara and Alison Pollard in my team at the OECD, who helped launch the work, and Mayanka Vij, who you'll hear from in just a moment, who led the development of the guidance from our side at the OECD. Unfortunately, due to a technical issue with our website, the guidance document is not yet available as I speak, but we hope it will be available before the end of today's event, and we will share the link in the chat. And if not, we promise to send it to all of you after today's meeting. So today's session will start with a quick scene setting from Dr. Jörg Faust, who is the chair of the DAC Network on Development Evaluation and also the head of DEval. We will then have Gavich, and then we will open up for our panel discussion. And I'm really excited to have such a great lineup of speakers for the panel. We have Shravanti Reddy, Danielle Jacobo Oreo, Boneface Masa, Joseph Soweto Akoro, and they bring a range of expertise and perspectives on rights-based approaches to evaluation, including gender-responsive evaluations and evaluations incorporating the rights of people with disabilities. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion, as well as to hearing from all of you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jörg Faust. Over to you, Jörg.
Thank you, Megan. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Perfect. So, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this event on human rights and gender equality in the evaluation, and particularly in the usage of the OECD evaluation criteria. Thank you for joining us today in Germany and around the world for this gLocal launch of this new EvalNet publication, which is, I guess, a very timely and needed one. So I don't want to talk in detail about the development context, but I guess everybody would agree that in the past few decades, there has been an evolving recognition and commitment towards a human rights-based approach in the pursuit of sustainable development. And most importantly, or perhaps most well known in this context, are the 2015 SDGs and the Agenda 2030, a universal agenda which explicitly recognizes the interlinkages between human rights and sustainable development. Nevertheless, we also see that, for instance, current crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionate and abruptly impacted on a huge amount of marginalized populations, and came along with many threats to the fulfillment of human social and political rights, as well as civil liberties. So this example of a concurrent crisis underscored a need to critically reflect on whether and how international development interventions impact on the promotion, on the protection, and on the fulfillment of human rights. And in this regard, many countries around the world have made gender equality a top political priority. Particularly, but not only, of course, within the OECD DAC, we do observe an increasing number of bilateral providers of ODA explicitly prioritizing gender equality, the empowerment of women and girls in their development cooperation programs, and also in their foreign policies. So against this background, and in order to strengthen the effectiveness of our endeavors to strengthen, to promote human rights and gender equality, evaluation and evaluation systems should and hopefully have played a crucial role in kind of building a critical feedback loop to policymakers and implementers. And thus, integrating human rights and gender equality across evaluations comes with a known set of unique and persistent potentials, but also challenges, which we will hear more about later today. And so already during the extensive consultation process for reforming the evaluation criteria between 2017 and 2019, we heard a lot from partners around the world about issues related to the criteria and the linkage, the potential linkages between the criteria and human rights and gender equality. We also explored within the EvalNet proposals to add additional criteria, including proposals to add gender equality and human rights as a standalone criterion. Some of these challenges were incorporated into the updated definition in 2019, which better respond now to the imperative principle of leave no one behind and supporting equality. And many of the comments during that times were included in the 2021 guidance on applying the evaluation criteria thoughtfully. But at the same time, it became more obviously that a more detailed guidance was needed on how to evaluate in ways that reflect more deeply human rights and gender equality in issues. In this regard, also our sister network, GenderNet, within the OECD, developed a guidance, a more encompassing guidance for the entire project cycle, including planning, monitoring, and also evaluation. But we still thought within EvalNet and within the criteria that we would we need kind of a document, a point of orientation, particularly geared towards the OECD evaluation criteria, which now are gaining more and more importance in areas beyond development cooperation. So this new work, this guidance, this helpful orientation, which we will present today, contributes to these ongoing discussions and support practice with a focus on how the OECD evaluation criteria can be adopted with critical considerations on human rights and gender equality. On a personal note, for us at the German Institute for Development Evaluation, but also in a broader German context of development cooperation, my guess is that this document will substantially help us to improve our evaluations and hopefully also the use of them, particularly as the German government is currently putting much more emphasis on human rights and gender equality within a feminist policy approach towards development cooperation. To conclude, I think we have an ambitious agenda, but we have great evaluation criteria, and hopefully this guidance will make will improve our evaluations in making them more apt to address critical human rights and gender equality issues. I hope you find this new publication as helpful as I do, and that it will spark reflections and insights in your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jörg. And really interesting to hear that perspective on the German development cooperation context as well. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor to Mayanka Vij and Martin Bruder to present the new documents. But before I do that, just to kind of do an icebreaker for all of you in the audience, we have two short polls, which we'll go ahead and launch. The first is, which evaluation criteria do you use the most often in your work? And the second is, which evaluation criteria of the 6 would you consider to be the most important when you're evaluating from the perspective of human rights and gender equality? So look forward to hearing your responses. Just an informal poll to get you all active today. I'll go ahead and hand the floor over then to Mayank.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We're very excited to be able to present the key messages from the new publication, applying a human rights and gender equality lens to the evaluation criteria. As Megan already mentioned, this isn't online yet, but we will circulate a version with you after the meeting, if it's not online by then, but hopefully it should be. So without further ado, Martin Bruder and I will present today the guidance. Next slide, please. And as we already heard from Megan and Jörg earlier, the rationale that underpins the development of the guidance kind of stems from the revision of the OECD evaluation criteria in 2019, where there was a highlighted need for more specific guidance on this area. It also finds its roots in, increasing political prioritization of rights-based approaches and of gender equality, and a commitment of DAC members across the board and non-DAC members to address and overcome structural inequalities and discrimination. We notice in an upcoming review of evaluation systems that there also has been a concerted effort by evaluation units in DAC member countries to include gender equality considerations and also adopt rights-based approaches to evaluations. So what this report, what this document actually focuses on is the criteria specifically and how to adopt these criteria with a human rights and gender equality lens. So, disability inclusive and gender responsive rights-based approaches to evaluations by and large include two essential considerations: what evaluations examine and how evaluations are undertaken. The focus of this report is on the what and the content aspect. But throughout the document, we refer to useful tools and guidances that have already been developed by different institutions. And we offer practical examples of evaluations that reflect the concepts that we discuss in the text in the document. And overall, this guidance is intended to help evaluators, evaluation managers, and program staff to reflect upon and hopefully also increase the extent to which interventions and then subsequently their evaluations consider human rights principles and gender equality norms and standards, using the criteria as an entry point to do so. Next slide, please. So the contents of this document are on, well, what does this actually entail? So what does a human rights and gender equality lens include? And what evaluation questions to ask? What practical examples of good evaluation practice are there? And then what are the common challenges that people face in this field? Next slide, please.
Yeah, hey everyone. This is to give you a break in speed. The first criterion we consider is relevance. So relevance assesses the extent to which the intervention's objectives and design respond to the needs, rights, and priorities of rights holders or beneficiaries, and how they continue to do so if circumstances change. Next, please. As Mayanka said, we always structured this in key considerations, challenges, and then there's sometimes an example which I won't be able to go into detail about now, but just for you for further reference also. So when we look at relevance, relevance is about assessing, or it involves also the understanding how contextual factors, power dynamics, and intersecting forms of discrimination may affect rights holders, especially those most marginalized or at risk of discrimination. And when we look at that, key considerations would be identifying beneficiaries or rights holders and their respective rights, needs, and priorities. Then assessing the design of the intervention, accounting for drivers of marginalization and power imbalances, and considering intersectionality when we unpack multiple forms of discrimination. So that's all sounds fair enough, but all of you will know that this comes with considerable challenges, which of course in the document can't be resolved, but we try to be clear about what these challenges are. So one challenge we think is who identifies who actually are rights holders and beneficiaries. There may be competing priorities between rights holders and duty bearers with respect to what human rights are most relevant within the intervention, and also between different rights holder groups themselves. Another challenge is that we often meet is that context and vulnerability analyses often aren't conducted in the quality that we like to see them at the outset of an intervention. So how much of that can be salvaged at the stage of the evaluation? And then how to best reconcile the limited data and limited resource issues, right? So specifically when we look at intersectionality, there's a very substantial demand on fine-grained data, and that comes, of course, with high levels of resource intensity, and the decision as to where to dig deeper and where to stop is a highly political one and very sensitive one as well. To move on to the example, the United Nations country team in Palestine did a common country analysis. And this analysis had a deliberate focus on vulnerability and asked why some groups were systematically more disadvantaged than others. And that helped to set a benchmark and a baseline, if you want, for future evaluations to assess the intervention's relevance against. So this is one example of trying to take an intersectional perspective on being disadvantaged and using that in the evaluation process. Next.
Moving on to coherence. The coherence criteria is meant to assess the compatibility of an intervention, with other interventions in the country, sector, the same institution, and also the extent to which other interventions, policies, for instance, support or undermine the intervention, or vice versa. Next slide. When looking at coherence with a human rights and gender equality lens, it entails assessing the consistency of that particular intervention with regional, international, and national human rights and gender equality treaties, legislation, and commitments, policy commitments. So for targeted interventions, an evaluator, for instance, should consider the complementarity and the coordination of an intervention with those of other human rights and gender equality actors. Internal coherence with this lens would include a vertical and an assessment of the vertical and horizontal alignment of an intervention across the country or agency's policies. So for instance, a development, whether or not gender equality objectives are aligned with trade and foreign policy, for example. Another aspect of internal coherence is alignment with policy commitments, and external coherence involves looking at cooperation and coordination with external actors, such as civil society that might be active in the country itself, on shared human rights and gender equality priorities. Now, this does, of course, come with challenges, which might be that for interventions that affect several human rights at once, identifying the most relevant policy or legal instrument against which you assess coherence can be challenging. It can also be time-consuming and resource-intensive. And then the second challenge is that, and perhaps more complicated, is that different stakeholders involved in the intervention might hold different views about the different human rights. So, for instance, international funders and national legal frameworks might have different approaches to women's rights in a particular context. Now, one example that we bring forth in the document is the action plan for the inclusion of persons with disabilities, which guided the efforts of German Development Corporation on disability inclusion, was evaluated, and it had 3 objectives, and it assessed each of its 3 objectives against the relevance and coherence of the relevant policy instrument, which is the provisions from the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, essentially asking to what extent do the selected fields of action and measures correspond to the provision of the CRPD. And then similarly, UNDP also evaluated its Disability Inclusive Development Plan and looked at the extent to which the principles and provisions of the CRPD, the same instrument, was reflected in UNDP's strategic plans. Now, while coherence could be applied in any evaluation, the intensity and the detail of a coherence analysis might differ depending on the type of intervention that's evaluated, the purpose and the context of the evaluation. And then some agencies have taken a risk-based approach, so focusing the evaluation or the coherence analysis on the potential identified or reported areas of incoherence and harm. And that might be one way in which the resource intensity and the time consumption of this particular analysis could be addressed. Next slide, please.
Effectiveness as a criterion considers the extent to which the intervention has achieved its objectives. Next slide. A human rights and gender equality lens helps to bring in an equity focus and helps support evaluators to assess the extent to which the intervention has involved rights holders, including people of different genders and marginalized groups, and has reduced inequalities or otherwise improved their situation. So what are the key considerations in that with respect to that criterion? The first question is not only what was achieved, but also how it was achieved. And this incorporates or can incorporate human rights principles in the analyses, human rights principles such as non-discrimination and equal opportunity, participation and empowerment, or transparency and accountability, but also aspects of accessibility, for example. So it's not only about the effects on marginalized groups, but also the way that the process of the intervention has respected those human rights principles. As always, investigating negative unintended consequences is a relevant aspect of looking at the effectiveness criterion. But this is kind of a more focused approach with a human rights and gender equality lens, in that it brings into focus the most vulnerable groups, as well as differential effects of the intervention depending on intersectional aspects of discrimination. That's the next point, so unpacking differential effects of the intervention. And the last point or last key consideration is, again, the focus on this process, gauging the level of participation and influence of rights holders throughout the program cycle as one consideration when looking at effectiveness. What are challenges? The first one is that we put here is assessing whether all human rights principles were incorporated in the intervention design and implementation. That demands considerable resources. Again, an analysis, vulnerability analysis of what the most vulnerable groups, but also the most relevant human rights in that specific context may help to focus here. Second point is identifying the degree to which the intervention contributes to the results is complex as always. And again, the point about disaggregated data specifically for intersectional analysis. The example, when you look at that in more detail, shows that although this might sound quite abstract, it's very concrete in the sense that the World Bank's or a World Bank evaluation showed that actually the heterogeneous effects of the intervention weren't considered within the intervention. It's about natural resource degradation, and actually that led to further disadvantage already marginalized groups. Next.
When talking about efficiency, a human rights and gender equality lens would allow an evaluator to assess the quality of implementation and the management of processes in converting input to results, and examining whether or not resources were allocated to achieve inclusive, equitable, and gender transformative results. When it comes to economic aspects of efficiency, a low-cost strategy might relate to economic efficiency, but with the human rights and gender equality lens, it would entail looking at whether or not relatively poor but still better off groups were reached through an intervention, and whether or not that reinforced existing discrimination patterns. With regards to operational efficiency, it entails examining how transparent, for instance, the budgeting process was, whether all stakeholders were aware of the costs involved with inclusive and gender transformative approaches, and whether or not the budget could be adopted to respond to changing contexts or power dynamics between different groups. Another one is the costs that are faced by partner organizations and rights holders themselves. So were there any trade-offs that were associated with engaging in an intervention for rights holders and groups themselves? Economic costs aren't always the sole determinant of efficiency. There's a range of factors that actually affect both cost and the time that it takes to achieve results. And so an efficiency analysis with a human rights and gender equality lens accounts for aspects of equity, inclusion, as well as opportunity costs when drawing conclusions. And evaluators do need, and also program staff more broadly actually, do need a sound understanding of the context, the potential unintended effects, and then the eventual trade-offs in their efficiency analysis. There are challenges such as, of course, disaggregated data, and also whether or not there exists data on the relative investments for each of the different groups of right holders, whether or not that has been recorded. In the example, for instance, we talk about an NGO program by HIFOS, which was implemented with the objective to ensure that citizens could engage, meaningfully engage in public resource allocation and policy decisions. And what its evaluation actually found was that it took longer for marginalized groups to access and use information and data for advocacy. And often the cost for properly reaching and engaging these groups was underestimated. Thinking about mobility for meetings, payments to radio stations, creation of safe spaces for women only, transportation, translation. These were all costs that were often underestimated, but if they did lead to a higher engagement, it would be a more efficient use of resources to actually reach the most marginalized groups. Next slide, please.
Okay, with the impact, we move to the question of what difference is the intervention making in the sense of higher level, significant positive or negative changes. Next slide, please. So again, the key considerations here are capturing these transformative higher level changes at different levels of analysis, if you want, so at the individual, institutional, societal level, and assessing, that's the gender equality and human rights lens, assessing whether drivers of marginalizations or root causes are actually addressed and ideally transformed or shifted by the intervention or the activity. Again, you can see that's a recurring topic. The question is about differential effects. Okay, I can see that there's questions about the sharing of the presentation. I hope you can see it. So there's a question about differential and unintended effects across different groups of people that again come into particular focus when taking a human rights and gender equality lens. The challenges of impact assessment are of course always there, in the sense that when we talk about higher level impacts, we talk about nonlinear complex causal relationships. There's long time horizons, which makes them challenging to identify and uncover. Again, this is kind of exacerbated by a focus that consciously tries to not lose sight of those who may not benefit to the same degree from the intervention than others. And Finland, in its education strategy and a relevant evaluation, showed that exactly that kind of unequal effect did actually occur in terms of different marginalized groups. Indigenous children did actually profit from the interventions, but children with disabilities and girls did not. And evaluation can play an important role in getting this into focus. Next slide, please.
When talking about sustainability and examining whether or not benefits will last, next slide, please. A human rights and gender equality lens helps evaluators to assess the extent to which the system has social and institutional capacities to sustain changes that have taken place, and whether the intervention then has contributed to building an enabling environment for a continuous realization of human rights and the inclusion of marginalized groups. Changes manifest in different dimensions, and that is also one of the areas that could be examined under the sustainability criterion. The individual level shifts in attitudes and perceptions, for instance, institutional accountability mechanisms that might be instated, and a systemic or societal level, which includes laws and policies that uphold legal protections. Changes at all levels reinforce and influence each other. So, an individual might be aware of their human rights, but they also need the resources as well as the policy and institutional environment to exercise these rights. And these interdependencies underline the importance of a holistic approach to ascertaining sustainability with a human rights and gender equality lens. And then thinking about actual and prospective sustainability, because higher level changes, especially in gender norms, can take decades to materialize, and they're not linear. Evaluators can examine, the extent to which positive higher level changes generated by the intervention, continued for key stakeholders after the intervention has ended, and then to assess the prospective sustainability, consider the extent to which measures are in place that would actually help sustain these effects in the future. It has this criterion comes with its own set of challenges, which is that because the contextual factors can be so complex, it's actually quite difficult to envisage the future when making a conclusion on whether or not something will last. Similarly, you have complex dynamics that affect, that act as like many multiple confounding factors in the evolution of norms and practices, again, to be able to make a conclusion on whether or not effects will last. The Finnish evaluation that Martin just mentioned actually also considered sustainability from the aspect of whether or not belief systems and learning outcomes, for instance, were changed for children, for young people and young people with disabilities. And the evaluation, though it did find indications of sustainability, mostly through organizations led by people with disabilities taking stronger positions in the policy arena, the prospective sustainability of this was evidenced by the support that the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs was able to play by supporting strategic advocacy, for instance, and then helping improving the reach of local NGOs that are in remote regions. Next slide, please.
Okay, so that was the 6 evaluation criteria. Just some final thoughts. As Mayanka mentioned at the beginning, this contribution focuses on the content of evaluations rather than the process. Sometimes that's difficult to disentangle, but the criteria in essence help to derive evaluation questions and therefore focus the evaluation on specific aspects. And I hope that became clear that there's that the document may help to trigger reflection that puts aspects into the focus that otherwise may not be. However, mainstreaming a human rights and gender lens to the evaluation criteria is, of course, much more than just this. One very important aspect that I just want to allude to at this point is the institutional and policy environment that can facilitate or impede a human rights and gender lens on the evaluation criteria. So policies can create an enabling environment for mainstreaming human rights and gender equality across all stages of the program cycle, including evaluation. For example, Jörg mentioned before, feminist foreign or development policy may affect which of the considerations that we've outlined above are focused on and included. And that may help to mainstream and sustainably anchor human rights and gender equality in evaluation practice. The same is true for the OECD markers and quantifiable targets that come with that. Some development partners have committed to certain targets on either the gender equality or the disability marker, and that, of course, can also focus attention on certain aspects of the interventions and the criteria that are used to evaluate them. Next slide, please. So on the final slide, just another aspect that affects mainstreaming of the human rights and gender equality lens is, of course, context and the impact that power dynamics and differences in cultural norms, values, and political beliefs can have on interventions is an overarching topic and challenge possibly that cuts across the entire process of development cooperation, but also the entire evaluation process and analysis. And this is particularly true in this context as there's fundamental power imbalances between different stakeholders from different contexts within partner countries, between partner countries and development partners, etc., are at play. So we don't want to be blind to these, but it's not treated in much detail in the document. How to deal with these challenges with respect to the how of the evaluation process, human rights principles can offer guidance, we believe. Besides realizing the do no harm principle, important principles can be non-discrimination, taking into account intersectional forms of discrimination, ensuring meaningful participation that goes beyond contributing data and start engaging with rights holders in the governance of the evaluation. And this also involves difficult aspects of representation and the question of who can actually speak for which group. At the the end, some form of representation will likely be unavoidable in the process of ensuring meaningful participation. And finally, ensuring transparency towards stakeholders across all process steps of the evaluation. So with that, I'll hand over to Megan. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you'll be able to read the document soon, and looking forward to hearing the panel's thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Martin and Mayanka, for the very clear presentation. And just to address, as stated in the chat, we will share the PowerPoint presentation where you can see the summaries as well as the document as soon as it's available. So I'm now really excited to welcome our 4 panelists, and I will introduce each of them and then kick off the discussion. We have a couple of questions for the panelists, and we'd also like to engage with you, the audience. So please do use the chat function to share any questions or reflections that you have also for Mayanka and Martin, or that come up for you as you listen to the panelists. So first we have Shravanti Reddy, who has over 20 years of experience working on complex and joint evaluations, including at UN Women and UNICEF. And Shravanti worked as the co-chair of the UNEG working group that dealt with human rights and gender equality and developed the UNEG guidance on these issues. Her focus is on integrating gender equality, human rights, as well as environmental considerations into evaluation. Welcome, Shravanti. Thank you for being with us. We also have Joseph Soweto Okoro. Joseph is joining us from Nigeria, where he works as an independent evaluator. And Joseph's focus of his research is on participatory approaches to evaluation, with a focus on the inclusion of disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, including especially women, girls, and LGBTQI people. He's also done work from a feminist approach perspective, including working with the World Bank and with Global Affairs Canada. So he has a lot of experience both in his local context and in the global context, which of course suits quite well to today's gLocal conversation. Welcome, Joseph, and thank you for being with us. Next, I'd like to introduce Daniel Jacobo Orea from Spain. Daniel is coming to us from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Spain. As we've heard a bit about, Spain is one of the countries of the OECD that has been championing a human rights perspective and a gender equality perspective in their international development cooperation. And Daniel, in his role, is leading current evaluations looking at strategic perspectives of Spanish development cooperation, including evaluating the response of Spain to the COVID-19 pandemic. And he is also active in EvalNet and has been a major contributor to the development of the document that we're presenting today. Also, given Spain's feminist foreign policy and the historical prioritization of SDG 5, Daniel has been a key advisor on these issues of developing gender equality and human rights perspectives and the evaluation criteria and norms that we're discussing today. So welcome, Daniel, bienvenido, and thank you for being with us. And finally, Boniface Massa. Boniface is joining us from Malawi, and he has been elected as a Mandela Washington Fellow and also a Community Engagement Exchange alumni. And he works with the organization called Stand Up Malawi, and he's the director, sorry, Standing Voice Malawi, which is a civil society organization that supports and advocates for the protection and promotion of human rights for people with albinism. His specialty is in community-based programming and with a focus on the rights of people with disabilities, women, children, and youth. Thank you so much for being with us, Boniface. Welcome. So today we're going to kick off the discussion looking at the issues of how evaluators in particular, and that could be those commissioning evaluations or conducting evaluations and others working in sustainable development, can account for intersectionality. And intersectionality, of course, means the overlap and the aligning of various forms of discrimination to ensure fair representation and meaningful participation in evaluations. So I have a couple of questions for the panel. And again, please put your own questions to the audience, put them in the chat. So I'd like to kick off with you, Shravanti. And you have played this important role working with the UNEG And I know the UNEG represents many different perspectives, and you work developing this guidance. Also specifically looking at methodologies and approaches, which I think is really key area. We heard about a lot of the challenges around human rights and gender perspectives in evaluation during the presentation. And I'd like to hear your perspective on how you have seen these challenges change over time. Where are we today compared to where we were maybe 10 years ago? And how do you think the evaluation community has responded to the challenges that have been raised? Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And first of all, congratulations on the new guide to everyone. And also thank you for inviting me to speak today. I think that's a really great question. And, you know, I think what I've observed is that there has been progress, but the progress has not been linear and has been a bit slower than what I, hoped for. And I think it really mirrors the reality of all work related to ending inequalities. A quote by Martin Luther King Jr. I think fits well here is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I would add it's also paved by very good intentions, right, by everybody. So I think by this, I really mean, I have not observed like consistently steady and increasing improvement in terms of applying human rights and gender equality in evaluation, but rather improvements, we have real improvements. And then there's always a little bit of regression, some continued resistance, and sometimes deprioritization in practice, especially with the feeling of being overwhelmed with too many intersectional considerations that need to be incorporated. And I think this really means that we have to be consistently vigilant and continue to advocate for the focus on human rights and gender equality issues in evaluation to maintain the gains made and continue to make more gains. I began working on integrating human rights and gender equality in evaluation, specifically beginning in 2007 with the UNEG Human Rights and Gender Equality Task Force. I actually conducted a mapping of existing guidance at that time and found that, in that mapping that there was really very limited information available. And so I really see progress today in that there are so many more resources available on the issue, including, this new guide. And I think this really reflects how much more there is acceptance of the reasons for why we need to integrate human rights and gender equality in all evaluations by evaluation commissioners and also stakeholders. And we see that not only are there more guidance documents, but human rights and gender equality are more explicit within evaluation norms and standards, including the UNEG norms and standards. Evaluation policies of entities and organizations or associations, also in evaluation criteria, and also I would say within evaluation terms of reference. I think a lot of evaluation terms of reference really sort of address this, where we also see more intersectional guidance related specifically to certain human rights dimensions, such as disability, et cetera. And I think that that's really progress, sort of further unpacking this work and what needs to be done. So all those are like major achievements. And I think the challenges exist more now in terms of the practical applications of these norms, standards, and guidance, and also, especially in the implementation phase of evaluations beyond the terms of reference stage. And I think a lot of the challenges that are listed in the guide, those still exist. I think there'll always be an element of that exists. But I also think it requires sort of changing the way we think and understand evaluation processes to unfold and making some more intentional decisions based on like a cost benefit analysis, specifically for the human rights and gender elements of evaluations. I think there's no evaluation process that will be perfect or comprehensive. We know that. But resources related to having the time and space for the actual conduct of an evaluation, the analysis, and also the dissemination phases to incorporate these elements is, I think, where the real challenge remains. And I think that applying human rights and gender equality within evaluation criteria is actually one of the very important ways of ensuring some measure of focus on these issues throughout the evaluation process. I see it's worked, really well when there is an explicit criteria drawn from the principles of human rights and gender equality, or having that as the criteria itself, along with having it mainstream throughout the other criteria. And when you have that, I think it really acts as a beacon for the evaluation team itself to focus on that when other competing priorities and pressures come into play during the process, which we know they definitely do. I think another challenge is that it's really difficult to address the number of different human rights dimensions, focusing on all groups, and then when also focusing on specific groups to consistently incorporate gender dimensions as well. In that way, some of the intersectional elements are sometimes seen as competing for attention when they are really, I think, actually an important part of the same whole. And I think there's a little bit of shift of mindset that needs to be made there. And I think determining, other speakers spoke about this, and it's in the guide, determining the prioritization within evaluation processes and justifying certain focuses. I think that's a key challenge, but I do think that there's new approaches, some systemic approaches that allow evaluations sort of an honest path forward that address the practical elements of not being able to be comprehensive, because they also acknowledge what may be missing from the assessment. I could keep talking about some of the other challenges. I'll end here because I'm really interested to hear from the other speakers and from the broader audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really helpful perspectives. Let's turn now to Danielle. And I'm hoping you could share with us a bit more of the institutional and policy perspective and how you tackle these challenges in your context. And specifically, are there certain ways of working that you find can really support evaluators in these areas? Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon from Madrid. So it's a pleasure for me being participant of this guidance from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and now I'm honored of being with this such great fellow panelists to share how we institutionalize the gender equality and human rights based approach in Spanish cooperation. So reading the guidance and the presentation, I think that institutional enablers are the most important key for Spanish cooperation to have such a great experience in mainstreaming these two cross-cutting focuses. So definitely, I think this creates an enabling environment for not only evaluation managers, but also to all the different processes of the program or the policy cycle. So this year, the Spanish cooperation succeeded to approve a new law. That includes the new law of sustainable development cooperation and global solidarity, where it acknowledges gender equality and human rights as a key cross-cutting element. It also includes it in their objectives and principles, and also make considerations that these cross-cutting issues, these cross-cutting priorities should be mainstream in all the policy cycle of design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So for me as an evaluation manager, having an object of evaluation that already worked from the design and from the implementation in taking into account these approaches makes much easier later for us to give the final lessons and the final good practices to keep on going with this virtuous cycle. Then this enabling environment also help the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Spanish agency to create different instruments, such as ICID's Gender in Development and Human Rights Mainstreaming Guidance, and also our policy of evaluation that includes these cross-cutting issues. So definitely for us it's very important to have this culture, and this guidance led by the DAG Network on Development Evaluation push our capacities to have more instruments and more technical capacities to apply the criteria in evaluation. So finally, I think the criteria is the core of an evaluation, and having these clear definitions and clear scopes inside each of the criteria will be very useful, and we will start exploring and using it, because at the end each of our systems of cooperation has its specialities and specificities. So yeah, I think it will be something very useful for us. And finally, I might say that defining really clear on your terms of reference of the evaluation, what are the informational needs from managers and from the different groups, helps a lot to undertake the evaluation in the way that it includes gender equality and human rights based approach. And finally, participation of different CSOs and gender specialists it's always a challenge for us, but something that we really try to prioritize. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and always ending with this important point about the terms of reference and the quality of the terms of reference, as well as the participation of different partners. I'd like to turn now to Boniface to hear your perspective on and learn from your expertise about integrating disability into evaluations, and which challenges do you find that are the most common? And then maybe picking up on a point that Shravanti said about the need for a change in perspective from viewing different forms of discrimination as being competing, and acknowledging the heterogeneity and intersectionality of different disabilities and different forms of discrimination. How do you approach disability inclusion as a cross-cutting objective? And particularly, how do you do that in an intervention that doesn't, or if the evaluation object does not prioritize inclusion itself? How do you bring that perspective in? Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the publication. It's really a very good publication, and I hope it will be made accessible to all persons with disability and in different formats. I think it's really very useful. Let me start by contributing by raising the issue of self-representation and participation. I think that's where it all starts from. The publication has tried, I think, to highlight that as a challenge, and I would still say that it remains a challenge when we look at participation and self-representation of persons with disabilities in evaluation. And I think interesting to mention is how we have looked at participation by treating persons with disabilities as by providing equal treatment. Yet we know that we have different layers of disabilities. We have also experienced issues of how do we ensure that we then move from that equal treatment to ensure that we provide differential treatment, and also while we are still considering the unique needs of each individual when they're participating in the evaluation. Another interesting element of the publication is how it has looked at the issues of rights holders and beneficiaries. If I look at that, I've been involved in evaluation and I've worked with Marty. At what point am I beneficiary? And at what point am I a rights holder as a person with disabilities, as an evaluator? So I think that cutoff point, it's really important for evaluators to consider. So when I do work, I am an evaluator, but at the same time, I am a person with disability. How do I manage my business towards that evaluation? So I think that it's also something that is really important when you look at the pillars of cohesion, effectiveness and all that, and really important that we need to reflect on that. The other challenge has been to deal with issues of reasonable accommodation, which in an evaluation often it's linked to issues of budgets and all that. But for me, really it's a question of how do we provide this reasonable accommodation while not modifying the circumstances of persons with disability themselves in an evaluation. And if you look at that challenge, it all starts from, it was left in the programming itself. So there's no way you could capture it in an evaluation if it wasn't included in the actual implementation of interventions. So that has been, I think, the biggest challenge when you look at the inclusion at the end, while at the beginning, there wasn't any intention of bringing persons with disabilities to participate in that intervention. So I think we still need to talk more on the how do we ensure that we capture issues of reasonable accommodation in a way that it doesn't the impact or the situation of persons with having disabilities in an evaluation. I would also want to share my experience around the accessibility, which is, I think, now a big pillar in most human rights, international human rights instruments and also domestic instruments when you talk about accessibility. So my interest as an evaluator with a disability would be, how do I make sure my tools are accessible to persons with disabilities? But at the same time, the whole issue of rights holders and beneficiaries comes in, because how do you make sure that your information or your tools are also accessible to those that you are assessing or you are evaluating? So I think it's something that it's too challenging. It has been tried to address in the publication, but I still feel it's something that we need to ensure that we create tools, we make information accessible for persons with disability to fully participate. Finally, I think let me finish by talking about intersectionality, which is really, I think, interesting, because if you look at gender, if you look at disability, yes, I have albinism, I am a man, I work. So all those layers as a person with disability, I think, are so doing an evaluation in how do we then avoid fragmenting our needs and our experiences as persons with disabilities. It's good to know that there's been progress. Now we have the Washington Group of Questions, which most countries are using, most development partners are using. But I think the biggest challenge has been how do we bring those Washington Group of Questions into indicators of success or impact in our evaluations. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And I really like this perspective of, for each of us as individuals, is who are we within this evaluation process? And of course, we're all humans first, but then this questions of different identities, really interesting. Thank you so much. And I also like the point around the real accessibility of the different tools that we're using actually within an evaluation, really important point as well. And I think we could use some work on that on our side as the OECD. Certainly we have room for improvement. So thank you so much. And let's turn now to Joseph, who brings us extensive experience in evaluation, especially with a focus on gender equality objectives. And we'd like to hear also your perspective on these different challenges we've heard from the rest of the panel. And also, again, sort of this question of how do you address these issues when you're evaluating an intervention that maybe does not specifically target human rights or gender equality. I was struck in the process of updating these criteria in 2018, 2019, how often I heard people say, yes, gender equality is important when you're doing those type of interventions, but for my work, it's not so relevant. It's not relevant for the work of a multilateral bank or, for infrastructure projects. And so this idea that it only applies to certain types of activities or programs, I think is unfortunately still quite rife. So how do you approach it, those types of evaluations while retaining this rights-based perspective? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Go ahead, Joseph.
Thank you, Megan, and I wish to congratulate the OECD for this guidance. I think it's coming in. It's actually timely at the point where we are beginning to look at inclusion, even within evaluation processes and approaches. And thanks for the opportunity that you've given me to speak on this subject. So yeah, it's to your question. It could be very tricky, and I have I've experienced some of these difficulties where I have to evaluate projects that are not necessarily directed. I mean, like have objectives that are related to gender equality or even inclusion. But again, the interesting part of it is that for every project, especially development project, at the end of those projects, there is the humans. And so this is where the human right concept comes from. Really becomes important, and even the gender equality aspect of evaluation. And usually, what I do personally is to look at, is to kind of conceive the process from a beneficiary perspective. So who are the beneficiaries? Because when we are looking at the approaches to apply when it comes to evaluation, we want to make sure that the beneficiaries are at the center of it. And that's what makes it human. I mean, it could be an agricultural project, for example. So there is this agricultural project happening in some rural areas. We want to understand, regardless of whether it is a gender equality project or not, we want to understand the nature of beneficiaries and how beneficiaries are having access to the project. So it could be, people with disabilities, it could be women and girls, and it could even be sexual and gender minorities. How do they have access to this agricultural project and the benefits of this agricultural project? I mean, of course, so what we're evaluating is effectiveness or even the efficiency, and sustainability and so on and so forth of the agricultural project. But we want to know how it becomes, and again, going back to the criteria, how it becomes relevant to the different populations that are intended beneficiaries of the project. So so this is how I approach it from a beneficiary perspective, and making beneficiaries the center of the evaluation, because that would be the common denominator of evaluating the different, looking at the criteria: relevance, sustainability, impact, and so on and so forth. We would be looking at that from the perspective of the beneficiary. So I believe that answers the question. And of course, in terms of benefits, the benefits is that, we from applying human right perspective, and even gender equality or even inclusion, we are the project implementers, I would say, are getting feedback on how the project is relevant and how to improve on it, what is working, what is not working, and for things that are working, how do they capitalize on things that are working, and how do they improve on things that are not working. So, and this is very important. This is, very fundamental when it comes to every project. In terms of challenges, I've been, talking about this kind of approach, human rights and gender equality, and even what we call a participatory approach. It is time consuming. It is very, it can be very expensive. But of course, I can give the experience of the evaluation that we did, my team did in Nigeria for Global Affairs Canada. Of course, in the initial stage, we have limited financial resources because of the different people that we had anticipated to get involved in the process, beneficiaries of the project to be part of the data collectors and not as data mines, because again, this is what participation means, this is what equity means, and even having beneficiaries at the center. But again, we had limited financial resources, but what we could do is to leverage on the human resource that is available in order to cover for those. There are strategies, but of course, I'm not going to go into the process of, how to apply the human right principle of gender equality. But again, there are ways to always leverage human resources that is available in order to cover for limited financial resources. But of course, this is one of the challenges. It is time consuming. So for example, for a regular research or evaluation, if you plan to have it for within a month, if you really want to apply human rights and gender equality and participatory approach, please give it 2 or 3 months. Reason is because I can give you a very typical example. For the evaluation that we did for Global Affairs Canada, we had a co-creation phase. And what this means is to get people involved at that phase. So we're not going to have evaluators having a blueprint of the process and saying that this is how we roll out. No, this is not, when you want to look at human right, apply human right principles and even gender equality, you want to get this, you want to get everyone on the table from the start to finish. And doing that, consulting, going back again, to consult, getting them involved at every process and getting their buy-ins. And even when they don't buy into particular strategy or approach, you want to reach a compromise, because this is all what it is about. It is very, very intense. And this is what time also equals money. So to, highlight in terms of the challenges, the time that and the financial principles when it comes to evaluation. Thank you. Of course, I'll be taking more questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joseph. And it's really interesting, this point about the time. And I think, but also maybe just to emphasize that, of course, it's not just a cost, there's also benefits. And the most costly thing we do is to continue wasting money on programs that don't work and don't reach people whose rights are not being protected. So I think really, really interesting perspective. Thank you. Such important points. And I also like this, your arguments around, even for an agricultural intervention, you have needs to understand how it affects different people, and really thank you for sharing those perspectives. So we'll open up the floor now. Please do put your questions in the chat. You can also use the raise your hand feature, which I hope people know how to use in the Zoom, if you'd like to ask a question to our panelists. And maybe I will pose a question just to kick things off, which is this issue around, I think we see sort of 2 different schools of thought. One is that you have these sort of evaluators as the cold scientific measurement people who are neutral and independent and shall just pronounce judgment on the intervention they're evaluating, or the idea that evaluators themselves have their own values, their own biases, and are actually actors within the change processes that they are evaluating, and indeed pursuing their own values or their own interests. And I think there's sort of tensions. Of course, it doesn't have to be necessarily one or the other, but I'd be curious to hear how the 4 of you experience these 2 perspectives. And maybe if we can also invite Jörg to come back, and Mayanka also, if they have thoughts on those questions as well. But Shravanti, maybe you want to take a stab at that. How do you see that perspective of who is the evaluator in this process? And then we'll go to you, Joseph. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Another very good question, and very relevant for a lot of thinking and discourse on evaluation right now. I would say I'm firmly in the school of thought that we all have a bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, purposeful or unintentional. And I think that identifying and addressing your subjectivity in the process is actually a way of bringing more objectivity to the evaluation through that disclosure. It feels a more honest way to conduct evaluations to me, while of course we are always striving to be as objective as possible. I think there's also sometimes where there's a bias and it's a purposeful bias. You know, sort of one example is feminist evaluation or indigenous evaluation, or like the approach that I was involved with, ISE for GEMS, that call for explicit focus and prioritization of certain dimensions. They have a political agenda behind them. And those agendas are in line with achieving gender equality, human rights. They're part of global norms and standards and conventions. So I think that that's a way where the bias, you know, you explicitly put forward the bias. It's part of the evaluation approach. And it lets everybody know that you're going to really be looking at that and you're coming from that lens. But of course, we also have biases that maybe work against some of those things. We all have it, you know, we're not perfect. And I, you know, personally, I learned something every evaluation that I have done, right? You have to question yourself. And I think it's really, that's a really good part of the evaluation process, right? You have to question your own assumptions, your own understandings. So that's what I would say about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Really resonates a lot of what you've said. Joseph, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sharanti, for that. And that totally reckons with how, I mean, like, I'm human. I've got my values, right? And I would always be biased because, you know, I've got my principles. And if I say that I'm conducting an evaluation from a feminist approach, that's already a bias. But the bias is in the process. And like you said, Sharanti, the bias is in the process, and I would go for to say that the bias does not translate into the results. The process enables, you know, us to collect, you know, certain kind of data that, you know, makes objectivity even clearer. Can you hear me? Okay, that makes objectivity even clearer. So we have, I mean, we set our bias through the approaches, through the process, and then once we get the data, the analysis of the data is something logical. So here, our bias is not in play. So we have all the data, and we look at it objectively in order to come up with, you know, this is what the result of this evaluation is, and this is how we are understanding it, and then we provide recommendations, right? So, you know, this is how it works. So I am an evaluator, but I do not see the other person at the end of at the other side of research as only a data mine. I also see them as an evaluator from a different perspective, because even asking questions and they're giving me answers, they can, I mean, usually we think that when we collect data, the respondents have no idea what we're looking for. They have an idea what we're looking for. So usually they want to say what they want to see as a result of that study. Yeah. You know, so or what they feel that you want to hear and things like that. So they are an evaluator themselves. So and that's why I always like, you know, I'm not going to treat a responder as a data mine. I'm going to treat you respectfully as who you are. You're evaluating this, but you're an evaluator, just that we have like different perspective from which we evaluate, but they provide information. They can choose to provide, you know, any kind of information they want to give based on your questions and your approach and things like that. So it's the approach really that brings out the objectivity of the evaluation itself. So yeah, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. Daniel, please.
Yes, thank you. So for me as an evaluation manager, actually, I think it should be something balanced between both the school of thoughts, because at the end, we as managers also, in our terms of reference, establish our mandates or our guidance or our bias. And And also, I think that evaluation is at the end is an approach that mixes quantitative and qualitative methods. And in this qualitative approach, there could be some room for different opinions. So also, I see the evaluation teams where we work with also as enablers of dialogue between the different parts of the evaluation. Thank you.
Yeah, important point as well. Good perspectives there. We've got about 5 to 10 more minutes, and I would like to open the floor if there's others in the audience that have questions or would like to come in. And we will circulate both the presentation and the documents. And Mayanka has also just shared that the pre-publication version is now available on our website. So I apologize that wasn't up earlier today. We did have a technical glitch, but you can download that now. So this, this is a really interesting perspective about who we are as evaluators, who we are in these discussions. I wonder if Mayanka or Martin, you wanted to come back in any perspectives or on this point?
Well, I feel I would come in from a personal capacity here, and I feel that as evaluators, as human beings, there's always a level of inherent subjectivity. It's unavoidable. Like complete objectivity is unattainable. And I also feel that evaluators do bring their own perspectives and values to the evaluation process, and acknowledging them at the outset can, well, minimize the bias. And of course, there isn't always just one person kind of making all these drawing the final conclusions, so to speak. I also think that as evaluators, then speaking about the role of evaluators per se, you can't separate that from the power dynamics that do exist within society, the position of influence and authority, like Joseph, what you said, when you engage with people with whose opinions you want to hear, a lot of the times you hear what they want to see or what they hope you will take back and perhaps feed into a process to improve an intervention in the first place. And claiming complete objectivity kind of also, I feel, ignores these power dynamics that often are at play between evaluators as evaluators and then evaluators as the individual identity that they then represent. And then I feel finally like evaluators do also have a role in amplifying marginalized voices and bringing them to the forefront and prioritizing them and their experiences, making sure that they're adequately reflected in evaluations. It's a way to address social justice issues from the perspective of groups that might not otherwise get a voice in evaluations and intervention design, or hopefully also policy making. And it is finally a way to encourage, accountability. It is, evaluators can also themselves act as activists, hold development actors accountable by highlighting inequities that they do experience in their own work. And so my take on this is, yes, I don't think that these are two mutually exclusive. Like, I don't think that just because you have a perspective and have a stance and bring your own values to a process, that then you are not an objective evaluator. Or I don't think that one kind of negates the other, but I do think that it is, my personal opinion is that evaluators are also in their own rights activists.
Thank you, Mayanka. Others from the floor, other questions for the panel that you'd like to hear from? Jörg, I'm not sure if you're having trouble with your connection, but if you aren't and you'd like to come in on this perspective about evaluators, are we the sort of neutral measurers, or are we activist evaluators, or where do we land in the middle? I think our panelists have very nicely broken down my dichotomy, but if you'd like to come in, please feel free. Looks like you might be having trouble with the camera. Yes. And I think it is a really good point that you make, Mayanka, and Joseph, you also mentioned it as well about, value, the word value is within the term evaluation. So it's not as if we don't have our own judgments. Bonfest, would you like to come in on this point about what is the role of evaluators? I think you mentioned it a bit as yourself in your own experience as an evaluator. Any other thoughts you'd like to share? Please go ahead.
No, thank you. Just to agree with the previous speaker that I think the important part is to acknowledge that they'll always be there. But also the idea of using this biasness in the process, I think is very important because it also helps a lot to get more information, but also try to help you to gather more data and clarity in your evaluation. I think the tricky part has been if you use that biasness, I think, in the analysis, because then it becomes so complex for you to bring that. But I think in the process, as it has been said, it's something that we definitely need to do. Coming from an activist point of view, I have used this like a lot in the process because I do evaluate some very sensitive issues. If you don't bring that biasness with traumatized individuals, it becomes so difficult for you to assess. But also when you do kind of legal and policy evaluation, you still need like to have that bring in that bit of biasness so that you understand the position, the political position of some of the policies, and also vis-a-vis what the beneficiaries are looking at that policy. So yes, we should apply it, I think, in the process without influencing, I think, the end results and analysis of our evaluations. I think is something.
Yes, and thank you also for bringing the perspective on trauma. And I think, you know, we're not talking about trivial issues here. We're talking about people who are losing their lives. The most fundamental human rights is people who are actually being killed in many cases. So these are also communities or people that are experiencing trauma, repetitive and systemic trauma over many generations. So I think that's a very important perspective that you raise, and maybe raises the point also of the perspective of doing no harm, and that sometimes the best thing to do is to not conduct an evaluation if there's risk of putting people at additional risk through our evaluative activities, which is an important principle as well. We're coming up on the end of our time with the panel, and I'd like to give a huge thank you to all of you for joining us, and to all of you in the audience for coming in. The document is available now on our website, and we will be circulating it to all the participants in today's meeting by email as well, along with today's PowerPoint presentation. So with no further ado, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for the work, the important work you do around the world to stand up for human rights and to protect people whose rights are at risk, which we know is all too much the case around the world in each of our own countries and globally as well. So a thought to all of those who are on the front lines of that fight, including the evaluators. And thank you all for being here and for the important work you do. Have a lovely afternoon and rest of your day.